We're taught for 100 years that blood pressure is really a vascular hemodynamic problem. I think it begins with the kidney, and I've written a lot about this. We think that it begins with anything that causes vasoconstriction to the kidney starts the whole process, where high blood pressure causes really active injury. That doesn't mean that lower blood pressures don't cause low-grade injury, but I'm talking about significant injury. That insulin resistance in the brain is really linked with fructose metabolism in the brain.
Dr. Richard Johnson is a professor in medicine and nephrology and one of the most influential living nephrologists and highest cited researcher on fructose metabolism. Dr. Rick, it's a huge honor to be with you today, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
It is a great pleasure to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
And since you're the highest cited researcher on fructose, my first question is about fructose. What are among the most common diseases that are linked to fructose molecule?
Okay, so just to give a background, fructose is a simple sugar, and it's found a lot in fruit and honey. And of course, honey is revered in the Middle East. But I have to say that the major source of fructose is not from fruit and honey, but rather from table sugar. So table sugar or sucrose consists of two sugars. One is fructose and one is glucose. There's also a sweetener that's used in many parts of the world called high fructose corn syrup, and it's a mixture of fructose and glucose in a liquid form. And it usually has fructose sort of dominating. It's a little bit more than the glucose in the mixture, at least for drinks. And high fructose corn syrup is used in a lot of soft drinks, for example. And fructose is, the major source comes from these added sugars, table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. So I would say that, when you talk about fructose, it isn't just talking about fruits and honey, but it's also talking about sugar intake. So a lot of people equate fructose intake in the big picture with sugar intake. And sugar and fructose are strongly associated with metabolic syndrome. There's a very strong relationship between sugar intake, for example, and the risk for insulin resistance, for diabetes, for hypertension, for fatty liver, for chronic kidney disease, and most of the metabolic diseases. Insulin resistance is probably one of the strongest. So our group has actually studied the role of fructose in experimental animals, in nature, in evolution, in human studies, and we've become convinced that fructose has a major role in all of these metabolic diseases, even diseases like Alzheimer's. And what we've really discovered is that although the major source of fructose is sugar and high fructose corn syrup in most parts of the world, the body can make fructose as well, and it can make fructose from carbohydrates. So really it's from glucose, which is the main, it's really the main sugar in most carbohydrates. Glucose, when it builds up in your system, if you eat a lot of foods rich in glucose, what we call high glycemic foods, that also generates fructose. So, it turns out that in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and one of the major issues is not so much the sugar, but often honey is added to pastries, and the pastries are high glycemic carbs, that basically bread that releases glucose at high levels, which then gets converted to fructose, and that whole combination is quite significant. And I've been to Kuwait and Qatar in Dubai, and it's some of the best food I've ever, sweetest, wonderful desserts. But I would say that a lot of those are ammunition for developing insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. So that's a long answer, about fructose. But it's important to realize it's not just what's in fruit and honey. It's really a bigger picture. It's sugar, it's breads, it's carbohydrates, and so it really is synonymous with high carb diets, high carbohydrate diets.
At which level does the body start to uh, convert glucose to fructose? Is there like a spike or a level that at the blood glucose will start converting fructose?
Uh, we don't actually know the specific level of blood glucose that triggers it. That would be a wonderful study to do in humans, actually. It would really, it's a thing that I want to know. I wear a continuous glucose monitor so I can monitor my blood glucose levels in response to foods. And some foods make my blood glucose go up much more than other foods, and that and but there's also a variability from person to person. So it turns out that there's certain foods that we can be pretty certain will raise glucose in everybody, but there are other foods that some people are more sensitive to than others. But at any rate, what I can tell you is that when I measure my blood glucose following a meal, based on uh, you know, connecting it with epidemiologic studies, I believe that the safe level of glucose is probably in the range of 120 to 125 or less in terms of, well, it may not be that safe to have a fasting blood glucose of 120. That's borderline diabetes, it's metabolic insulin resistance. But when you're insulin resistant, the real problem is when you eat a meal. So when you eat a meal, let's say your blood glucose is 110, you're probably making a small amount of fructose. Fructose is kind of made at different levels as the glucose goes up. It will go up as glucose levels go up. But when you're insulin resistant, or if you have a fasting glucose of 120, and you eat a donut or something, your blood glucose might go as high as 175, 180, 200, and just transiently. And when that happens, you're making a lot of fructose at that point. So when I say that I like to keep it at 120, that's what I like to keep my postprandial, or my glucose after I eat. So my normal glucose when I measure it might be like 95 or 85. I mean, it kind of depends. And then when I eat a meal, my blood glucose always goes up. But what I try to keep it at it is less than 130, ideally less than 120. And there's some data suggesting that people do better with uh, eating a low glycemic breakfast, for example. Like there was a study done in children where if you ate a high glycemic breakfast, you did poorer in school than if you had a low glycemic breakfast. And the blood glucose cutoff that they used was around 120 postprandial, 125. And if you had no breakfast, you didn't do as well in school either. So the best thing for children is not to skip a meal, but rather to eat a meal, but that one that just doesn't cause huge glucose spikes. Um, so anyway, so getting back to your question, we do not know, but we do think it's more like a dimmer switch rather than an off on. So a lot of people think from reading my work that there's an off on because I sort of write like that. But it's really more like a dimmer switch where
State.
the more you eat, the more the blood glucose goes up, the more fructose you make. And so it's more like that. So.
which level do you believe that a spike in glucose will start to cause endothelial damage or organ damage?
Well, it's always a balance of what the what good things are going on in you. So, for example, if you're 20 years old, when people are young, they tend to have very good vascular function. They have very good endothelial function. If you measure nitric oxide release or you look at some of these simple tests to look at vascular function, it's often good. Blood pressure is typically low when when you're young. It may go up with excitement or exercise, but in general, in the normal resting state, the vascular function is really good, and the blood pressure's not high. And this is often used by the sugar industry because if you give sugar to someone who has beautiful endothelial function and beautiful mitochondrial function, you can't really damage the endothelium very much because they have all the protective systems are so high.
Mhm.
In fact, I have a friend who works with the Tour de France, and those super athletes have incredibly good vascular function, endothelial function. They can drink soft drinks um, without any perceptible evidence of injury. We think they are having low-grade injury, but they can repair it very rapidly. And they have an excellent function. And so the problem is not when you're 24 and you have incredible endothelial function, but as you get older, the endothelial function slowly worsens. And if you're drinking a lot of soft drinks, suddenly you're going to get into trouble. So maybe when you get to be 35, suddenly the same dose of soft drinks is causing a problem. It's the same thing with, football players who are very powerful and muscular, and when they're active, they can eat a lot of food without a problem. But then as they get older and they're not exercising as much, they still eat the same, and then they get into big trouble. And your question's hard to answer because it depends on the underlying endothelial function of the individual. And if you're in the sugar industry and you want to show that sugar doesn't do anything, you pick an 18-year-old super athletic kid and he can drink all the soft drinks and run down the beach in his swimming suit, and everyone thinks the drink is safe, but he's just healthier than you are. So he can get away
Yeah.
with it. So bottom line is, um, yes, soft drinks are clearly associated with endothelial injury. We have shown that when you give fructose to animals, you impair endothelial function. We can show that if you give high doses of fructose, especially liquid fructose, you can accelerate kidney disease in animals. You can induce all features of metabolic syndrome. You can give it to animals and they will develop an Alzheimer's-like disease. Yeah, it it's all about the dose and the timing and how protected you are.
Mhm.
Um, and there's some things you can do that will protect you a lot from sugar. One is staying well hydrated. Drinking a lot of water actually protects you from some of the effects of sugar. Taking vitamin C can help protect you from some of the effects of sugar. The way you eat sugar, it makes a difference. If you're eating bread, which is a carb that can be converted to sugar, if you put avocado on it or something that will slow the absorption of the bread, your blood glucose won't go up as high, even though you eat the same amount of bread. And so you're going to make less fructose because you're slowing the absorption. When you slow the absorption, the rise in fructose is smaller and maybe more plateaued, but it's smaller. It doesn't get that big spike where you get the big spike of fructose.
Mhm.
If you we did a study with apple juice. If the reason juices are so bad is because they taste so good. You drink it really fast And if you drink it really fast, you get this huge dose of fructose into your system that overwhelms the protective systems and triggers bad outcomes because it's rapid absorption. But if you took that same drink and you just took a tiny sip every 15 minutes, you might not get that big rise in blood glucose or the rise in fructose in the liver will be plateaued, so the effects are less.
Mhm.
So a lot of it is understanding the physiology. When you understand the physiology, then suddenly you realize it isn't just the amount of fructose, it's how rapidly you take it. Is it on an empty stomach?
Mhm.
And there is this work that was done by Josh Rabinowitz, who showed that in the intestine, there's a deactivation of fructose that where it metabolizes it to a kind of I mean, it converts it to glucose, but it 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 slows the absorption of fructose to the liver, and the conversion of glucose to fructose is not as bad as just having fructose because not all the glucose gets converted, only a part of it.
Yes.
And so it turns out that when you eat like an apple that has like 6 grams of fructose, the first 4 grams or so gets inactivated in the intestine. So you're only really absorbing 2 grams of fructose. So the real problem with sugar, with foods that contain sugar is or fructose is when you eat foods that are more than 5 grams of fructose. So if people who say, "Oh, there's 3 grams of fructose in this," don't worry about it, right? That's not going to get you. It's 30 grams of fructose. Worry about it. You're going to get some. Like if you're going to drink a soft drink that has 30 grams of fructose, you are asking for trouble. But if you are eating carrots that have a little bit of sugar in them, right? They're a little sweet, just a tiny bit. You're not going to get into trouble. So it turns out that most vegetables that have fructose, really, it's not a issue. And most fruits, you can eat some fruits. There are, unfortunately, some fruits that are really high in sugar, and one of them is very commonly eaten in the Mideast and is loved, and that's figs.
And dates.
Everybody I know in the Middle East loves figs, and I totally understand it. They're really delicious, but they are like sort of like pure fructose.
Yes, and they
So,
love dates as well here also.
oh yeah, fruit, yeah, dates too. Those are the two ones. So, uh, if you love dates and you're listening to this program, you love figs, just know that it's view it like well, you guys don't really drink alcohol, but view it like something that you may really want it, but just take a very small amount. You give it as a treat. Don't make it a meal. Don't eat a lot. And but yeah, dates and figs are the two fruits that are super high in fructose. If you want ones that are very low in fructose, eat a kiwi. Kiwi doesn't have that much sugar, but it's very high in vitamin C, and the vitamin C actually neutralizes a lot of the fructose effects.
You talked about the CGM, and when you analyze the CGM, do you look at the spike of the glucose and the duration as well, or how do you analyze or
Yeah,
look at
it's
the data on
both.
CGM? Mhm.
Yeah, it's definitely both. It's,
What generally is a number that you don't want the glucose level to go above, like the height of the spike and also the duration? How long would you like the glucose to go back to baseline?
well, again, we don't really know the answer, so I'm just guessing based on my reading and my hypothesis. Hypothesis is based on reading studies and trying to convert it to what a testable hypothesis. But I believe that if you can keep your blood glucose under 120, under, maybe under 100 fasting and under 120, 130 postprandial, you're doing really good.
You're talking about the height of the spike, right?
Yeah,
The highest.
the high glucose of 130. Now, I will tell you that's probably not easy to do in the Middle East because there's so many breads that I think when I think about it, rice and potatoes. White rice is pretty bad. Potatoes are kind of not quite as bad, but they're not real good. Things like chips, where you have salted potato chips, and you can eat really fast. That's bad. French fries, that's bad. It turns out that salt accelerates the production of fructose. So, although everything is carbs, carbs plus salt makes you more fructose than carbs alone. So, if I took a French fry and I didn't put salt on it, I would make some fructose. But if I put salt on it, I will convert more of the glucose to fructose. And the reason is that salt, when you eat salt, the salt concentration transiently goes up in your blood. When the salt concentration goes up, you it translates into increased osmolality, and but it doesn't really matter. Increased salt in the blood activates the enzyme that converts glucose to fructose. So you can dramatically increase fructose production by raising the salt concentration in your blood. And animals will eat salt, especially in the summer. They'll go to salt licks as a mechanism to um, help them gain weight. And I believe that's because when you convert glucose to fructose, you activate this switch to help hold on to fat and all these other things. So I believe the salt lick is seeked. Animals seek it because when they're eating these grasses that don't have much nutrients, they can convert the carbs in it to fructose, which will help store fat and preserve glucose levels in the blood by causing a little bit of insulin resistance. It's a protective mechanism,
Mhm.
to help protect them.
When I spoke to Dr. Ralph, and he's one of the most accomplished diabetologists, he told me that one of the studies that the children of people who are severely insulin resistant, they were, when they did the test on them, they were severely insulin resistant with complete normal blood sugar. Um, so what are your thoughts about that someone can be severely insulin resistant with completely normal blood sugar?
I believe it does happen to some people. It's sort of interesting, um, if you go on a carnivore diet or like an Inuit or Eskimo diet, the your glucose levels are normal, but if you are then suddenly exposed to glucose, oftentimes you'll have kind of an accelerated or exaggerated glycemic response. So there are these situations where you can have a normal glucose level and be insulin resistant. And in fact, if you starve someone, believe it or not, if you starve someone, they'll become insulin resistant. Um, and if you do protein malnutrition, the animals will become or kwashiorkor, they'll develop insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is not always linked with obesity, and insulin resistance can be induced through a variety of mechanisms in settings where blood glucose may be normal or low. And I'm thinking of some other cases. If you take a person and you put them on a high salt diet, they will become insulin resistant within a week. Their insulin sensitivity goes down. This was a clinical study done some years ago. It was very surprising, but it makes sense with the work we've been doing. But anyway, bottom line is hyperinsulinemia is not a healthy sign, okay? It's not healthy to have hyperinsulinemia even with a normal blood sugar. And high insulin can do, kind of favors storing fat. if you're in need of fat, insulin resistance can be a good thing, and you can show that in circumstances. But um, yeah, usually insulin resistance is associated with hyperglycemia. Usually, insulin resistance is associated with a glucose higher than you normally would have. And that's because it's reducing the glucose uptake in the muscle. And by reducing that, the glucose levels will tend to stay high. But if you're glycogen deficient and you're in a situation where you're consuming glucose, I mean, your body's consuming the glucose faster than you can keep it up, you could have a normal glucose. There's also like you can have kidney failure with a normal serum creatinine. This was shown by Salo Clark in a study he did of natives from Venezuela who were malnourished and they had very low muscle mass and they had a creatinine of 1.2, but their GFR was like 20. So not always do the blood measurements equate with what we are used to thinking. And but insulin resistance does reflect a very significant issue going on. And in general, insulin resistance is not going to be healthy. At times, it could be uh, a survival response. So like if you're fasting, uh, prolonged fasting or starving, and you develop some insulin resistance associated with that, that may be a good thing because it helps maintain glucose to the brain during periods when there's a food deficit.
And that's reversible if someone
Oh yeah.
gets. Hmm?
Oh yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. And
Uh,
there were studies like all way back in the 1930s about this. Yeah.
are there cases where someone would lose a lot of weight or uh, do a lot of aggressive fasting? Will he become insulin resistant, and would that will cause to some extent some damage to the insulin sensitivity?
Well, I don't think it's been studied.
Mm.
Here's what we do know. We know that animals will be transiently insulin resistant to help them survive in the winter, but they don't seem to develop any long-term problems. So it's sort of like if you have a short-term insulin resistance to help you over a period of time in which it's helping you survive, it probably is not going to be associated with damage. But
Mhm.
at least if you do the analogy to nature. Um, the trouble with us is when most of us become insulin resistant, it's in a setting where we're continuing to eat large amounts of food and we're leptin resistance and we're eating and we're continually raising the glucose and inducing endothelial injury and doing all those things. So, the common situation where we should be thinking certainly is true. But if you go to these rare examples in nature and so forth, and you can see that it was, evolutionarily, it was meant to be a benefit. It's just that when you keep hitting it and doing it recurrently, then you get into this big problem. Yeah,
And
if we learned how to hibernate every fall, we probably would be okay. We'd be okay to eat more in the late summer.
insulin resistance can come in many organs. There could be insulin resistant in the brain, insulin resistant in the liver, insulin resistant in the adipose tissue. What are your thoughts on insulin resistant in different organs
I've done some work on Alzheimer's disease in which there's insulin resistance
in the brain?
in the brain, and some people call it type 3 diabetes.
Yeah.
And what I what I've been learning in the brain is that insulin resistance in the brain is really linked with fructose metabolism in the brain. So normally when you eat food, almost all the food is metabolized in the intestines and liver. And so like if I eat sugar, 95% of the fructose in sugar will be metabolized in the intestine and the liver. And only like 5 to 10% of fructose gets into the circulation. And then small amounts are metabolized in the kidney and other organs like the brain. And so it was long thought that the problems of fructose are really hepatocentric. In other words, that most of the effects of fructose are probably working through the liver. When we do liver specific knockout of fructose metabolism in mice, we block not just fatty liver and liver metabolism, but it's associated with a blockade of obesity and weight gain and all those things. So the liver seems to have a very central role in driving everything. But what we started learning is that, when you eat carbs and your blood glucose goes up, you start making fructose like in the brain. And so when you raise your blood glucose, you actually can show fructose production in the brain. And there was a guy in Yale who showed in humans that if he clamped the blood glucose around 200 in normal people, that large amounts of fructose are being produced in the brain, large amounts. And all this work done by my collaborators and friends and people I don't know as well. A lot of work has shown that when you metabolize fructose in the brain, you get insulin resistance in the brain, and you get mitochondrial dysfunction, and you get inflammation, and over time you get amyloid plaques and tau protein and
Alzheimer.
cognitive dysfunction. And people who are with Alzheimer's, at they've done it. They did a study where they looked at autopsy, and people with Alzheimer's have six-fold higher fructose levels than normal people, or I mean, people without Alzheimer's, who had been autopsied. And so the fructose levels are specifically high in Alzheimer's, and also the precursors for the production of fructose. So glucose goes to sorbitol, and then sorbitol is converted to fructose. And sorbitol levels are also high, showing that it's actually the fructose there is being produced in the brain. And now we know that you can get fructose production in the heart. For example, like with a heart attack, you'll start producing fructose in the heart. If you have kidney damage, you start producing fructose in the kidney. So fructose, because it can be endogenously produced, and because it can be produced in the body, doesn't have to just be produced in the liver. It can be produced other places. When it's produced in the liver, it causes obesity and metabolic syndrome. When it's produced in the brain, it seems to be associated with the development of Alzheimer's and also bipolar disease and other behavioral diseases. So one of the things that I've learned is that fructose, although it was meant to be a good thing, uh, in our society, we're eating too much of it. There was this old thing in Arabia, and you probably have heard of it, but the, many hundreds of years ago, figs and honey were loved because you had to like make it across the desert, and they would make these fig strings, and the people hiking across Saudi Arabia with their camels would carry these fig strings around their neck that had figs that people would eat. And when you think about it, I mean, it was probably life-saving, to have that in a situation where there was so little food, and this was such a good nutrient. It would give you that kick and a little bit of insulin resistance and all those kinds of things that could help. And interestingly, if you're starving, if you're actually starving, some of the figs will actually just provide glucose, because the fructose can be converted to glucose, just like glucose can be converted to fructose. So it's like this fantastic survival food.
Yeah, that's
And
what
when
happened also in
we
keto.
do gorp, there's this thing called gorp when you go hiking in the mountains and they raisins and which is fructose, right? With
Yes.
nuts and all these other things and a little salt. All these things are there to help you make the hike. And so there are these situations where a little bit of fructose clearly was beneficial, but if you're having trouble with, pre-diabetes and all this stuff, it's a different story, especially if you're not out hiking across a mountain. Uh,
Yes, even most of the things that come out of nature that has small amounts of fructose, the fiber will block it, but the things that are made in factories and the access of it what causes the damage.
yeah, right. Frederick Banting saw that, and he was the guy that discovered insulin. He got the Nobel Prize in 1922. And that was the time when diabetes was first beginning to become more and more common.
Yes,
And he recognized that refined sugar seemed to be a risk factor,
yeah,
whereas fruits did not. So he thought it was the refinement of sugar,
yes,
taking out the fiber and all the good things. And here's the guy who got the Nobel Prize. He was an orthopedic surgeon, right? And you know, and he just he had an interest in diabetes, and he read this journal article about um, people who would experimentally uh, make a stenotic duct to the pancreas. The animals would develop some pancreatitis, and the pancreas, the acinar or pancreatic enzyme tissues would go away, but it left all these little islets. And he thought to himself, you know what? Maybe those little islets contain the hormone that can control blood glucose, because they knew if you took a pancreas out of a dog, they would become diabetic. And there was this thought that that hormone might be in the islets. But the trouble is when you cut up the pancreatic tissue, the enzymes would inactivate the insulin. So here was an example. So he got this idea as a surgeon to try to isolate insulin from a dog. And so he goes on and discovers insulin, treats the first patient, gets the Nobel Prize. And then they said, well, okay, well, that's great, but what's causing diabetes? And he said, sugar. It's sugar, refined sugar. And then unfortunately, Jocelyn and these other guys that were studying diabetes said, hey, it seems like diabetics are eating more food than they're ex than they're expending, and maybe it's just that.
yeah,
And then the shift all switched.
to
But
the
what they didn't
calories.
recognize is that the sugar makes you eat more.
Yeah,
The sugar act causes the insulin resistance, right, and the leptin resistance that lead to you eat more. And so it is because you eat more, but it isn't because you just do it because you want to. You do it because you're activating these pathways that make you hungry. Yeah, it's
yeah.
it's the great trick.
Yeah, and you talk about it also multiple times. You talked about it that even in animals, it activates foraging and they start to
Yes.
go into territorials to hunt for food with fructose.
Yep, that's right.
I would want to ask you about hypertension. Hypertension diagnosis can be very challenging. Uh, how do you how do you establish the diagnosis of hypertension, especially that some people who are prone for blood pressure uh, variability, and some people are high, have tendency to have spike in their blood pressure. How do you establish the diagnosis of hypertension in these individuals?
Well, way back in the 1940s, actually maybe even earlier, someone did an arterial catheterization in normal people and found that during the course of a day, almost everybody hits a blood pressure of 150 at least once, the systolic. So we know that blood pressure variability really exists and blood pressure goes up and down. But, you know, in general, people with hypertension are going to have um, it goes through a phase. Really, there's sort of this phase called borderline hypertension where they're intermittently hypertensive, and some of them will have white coat hypertension, for example. When they get nervous, their blood pressure will go up, or when they're seeing a doctor, and then it becomes more persistent. What we usually do is, the first reading, if it's just mild elevation, what we'll do is we'll do, 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, or we'll have them take the blood pressure at multiple times. At different times of the day. What I do is I give them a blood pressure cuff. I say, measure your blood pressure and record it in this notebook and record the time. And I want you to do some in the morning. I want you to do some in the afternoon. I want you to do some in the evening. I want you to do some while you're resting and some when you just got back from exercising, et cetera, et cetera. I want to see the whole kind of picture. But there is data showing that borderline hypertension, where your blood pressure just goes up and comes down, even that is associated with an increased risk. So
Yes.
if it's once a week elevation of blood pressure to 150 or 160, I'm not going to be bothered by that. But if you're having multiple blood pressure measurements that are elevated, even if it would be borderline, I view that as you're moving into the phase of, there's a high risk you're going to develop persistent hypertension, and it's probably better to treat it.
Mhm.
And now what's happening is more and more studies show that people do better with lower and lower blood pressure.
Mhm.
There is a area region where if you drop the diastolic too low, you're not filling the coronaries very well. But for most people, it'd be great to have blood pressures of 130 over 80,
Okay.
especially if you have kidney disease. Um, you have to be kind of careful when you get older, like if you're 75 or if you're older, you often want to have a slightly higher blood pressure
Mm.
because they can't auto-regulate as well. So if you make their blood pressure 110 over 70, which a 25-year-old is perfect with, if you're 75 and you're 110 over 70, just a little bit of dehydration can plummet your blood pressure and you can become symptomatic. So you often with people who are a little bit more fragile, you're a little bit more forgiving on what your blood pressure goals are. But yeah, I would say repeating the measurements, not to be too alarmed. If your blood pressure is really high, if you tell me it's 220 over 120, you need to come to the ER, and uh, there is actually, you need to be evaluated right away. There's some people who have kind of a 200 over 210 over 170, 150 or something will have no symptoms. And they don't have any papilledema. They don't have protein in the urine. They don't have any symptoms at all. They don't have any risk factors or history of coronary artery disease. And that's the one type of patient where you could treat as an outpatient if you have them come back like every 2 days or something. And you can try to bring the blood pressure down. But if they have any kind of evidence of target organ damage, they
Mm.
had to get admitted to the hospital.
Yes. And when you say 130 systolic, you're talking about home readings or office readings. And how do you take the average out of 10 readings, or you average it out, or you're talking about the highest reading?
Oh, that's a tough one. I usually I usually am talking about clinic blood pressures, but if you're doing home blood pressure monitoring, I'll view that sort of like a clinic blood pressure. If I'm doing telemetry, 24-hour ambulatory, I'll follow the how they do the analysis, which is to kind of do multiple measurements, and they'll come up with an assessment of what percentage of time you are uh, above the goal. Um, I tend to try to get blood pressures to 130 over 80.
Mm.
That's 140 over 90 was the historic uh, level of hypertension, and it's kind of moving more to 130 over 80,
Yeah, the thing,
especially if you've got, especially if kidney disease.
yeah, the thing is there are so many people with borderline hypertension. I even believe that white coat hypertension is pre-hypertension, and
Yes, it is. I do too.
yes, and I think that hypertension develops the same way that diabetes develop, that the blood sugar will spike and then go back to rest the same way it will spike and then come back
That's a
to,
beautiful analogy, Fred.
yes, yes,
That's a beautiful analogy. That's really true.
yes. And then maybe one day it will go up and will never come down, and then it will become full-on hypertension.
Agree with you. There was a study actually that showed that 75% of people with white coat hypertension will be persistently hypertensive after 5 years. There was
Yes,
one study. Of course, there are probably other studies that didn't show quite that dramatic
yeah.
change, but
I,
we definitely know that it's a, you know, it's like metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is associated with elevated blood pressure, but not a hypertensive,
mhm.
theoretically. It's just mildly elevated. Compa- Nowadays, the new definitions that might actually be called hypertension.
Yes, and even I had Dr. Giuseppe, who was the former president of the European Society, and he did a study called the Pamela study, and they showed that white coat hypertension develop organ damage and
Yeah,
endothelial damage.
exactly.
Yeah, not as much as hypertension, but not as normal or
Absolutely.
baseline.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's really true. I've always uh, not been like a lot of physicians say, oh, you have white coat hypertension. Don't worry about it. I run into friends who say, I have white coat hypertension. I say, no, take care. You probably should be on a blood pressure medicine,
Mhm.
because uh, if you blood pressure's high in the doctor's office, it's probably high other times of the day
Yes, exactly.
when
Yes.
you're a little bit perturbed, and like when a person arrives, oftentimes that first blood pressure
Yeah.
measurement is high. We usually wait 10 till they've been resting 10 minutes. But I find that if the blood pressure is really high when they come in, I think that they are probably doing that every day whenever they walk
Yes.
around.
And working and
It's
driving.
Yeah, working and driving. I mean, the world is
Stressful.
anxiety producing, right? Especially these days.
Yes.
If if stress drives your blood pressure up every time you watch the news, you're gonna have you're gonna have high blood pressure. So yeah, I would say, um, you know, view it as a risk factor. And when you see borderline hypertension, look for, are you eating too much salt? Are you eating too much sugar? Are you eating too much carbs? Are you not exercising enough? And
Mhm.
all those kinds of things. Are you developing metabolic syndrome? Or and jump on it early.
Yes. And when you're,
Don't say, "Oh, don't worry, it's white coat."
that's the that's the issue,
I'm
right?
glad you agree with me, and it sounds like the other experts do too.
Yes. And when you say 130 over 80, are we talking about the average of the whole day? What if it's normal at home and then it's, if we put them on 24-hour blood pressure machine and it's 120 over 80 or even below, and then they have very high variability, it tends to spike. At those situations, do you
You,
medicate them? Do you?
yeah, you know what I like to do? I like to use inhibitors of the renin-angiotensin system, losartan, because it blocks sympathetic activation to some extent. It's not like a beta blocker, but it actually has blocks CNS sympathetic activation, and it improves endothelial function. It's usually very well tolerated, and like an angiotensin receptor blocker, like losartan, or an ACE inhibitor like lisinopril. But if you just put a small dose on, there's like no side effects, but it kind of takes that edge off, the and I feel better if they're, I mean, it's true if they have an ambulatory that says 120 over 80 is their average blood pressure, but every time they see me it's 150 over 100. I would put him on a, I would personally put him on an ACE inhibitor or a losartan, but low dose, make sure there's no side effects and see if that helps with that.
Yes, and every time it's
What do you do? Do you do something similar or what do you do?
yes, I mean, if there is an organ damage, then that's evidence to
Oh
treat. I
yeah, for
mean,
sure.
yes, and but the thing is, if they don't have organ damage, then it gets tricky. So you put them, try fix it little bit with the lifestyle and see how it works. Uh,
Yeah, lifestyle. Do a lifestyle first.
mm,
I mean, like they're not exercising or things like that.
the-
But most people are going to continue with their lifestyle,
yes,
despite
exactly,
what you tell them.
exactly.
But yeah,
The,
so yeah, it all depends. To me, there's not a great cost with taking 2.5 milligrams of lisinopril or 25 milligrams of losartan or something. They're now generic and they're and there was this guy Leon Fine. I don't know if you knew him. He was this physician scientist from Puerto Rico and Ponce de Leon University, and he would do all these experiments with mice. And he would take mice and he would put them on low dose ACE inhibitor or low dose ARBs. And he found that instead of, normally a mouse or a rat lives at the maximally 2.5, 3 years. That's their
yes,
lifespan. But he found that their lifespan was longer if they took these drugs. And he found that they had less end organ damage
yeah,
as they got old because as animals age, they start getting some end organ damage. And so he became a big advocate that low dose ACE and low dose ARBs might be good theoretically for everybody, but he did
yes,
never really said that. But it was the implication from his work that it can block the development of microvascular disease and arterial sclerosis and aging associated injury to the kidneys and so forth. But you know, I'm not advocating people to just take ACE or ARBs because you shouldn't do that from just a mouse study. But I do think that if your blood pressure's labile, and every time you go see the doctor, your blood pressure's high, um, my belief is that you probably have this problem more than just in the doctor's office. And even if you know, other things are saying the blood pressure is normal, if the blood pressure is elevated every time I see you, I'm going to probably want to put you on something that has very little side effects and that can improve endothelial function and lower blood pressure.
and when do you lean little
That
bit,
puts you into that group of drugs.
and when do you lean more on medication once this starts to go above 140 over 90, or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the very best is just reduce if they're eating a lot of sugar and salt. We did a study in people, and this is actually sort of interesting. We did a study in people with Mehmet Kanbey, who's a, a physician from Istanbul. This guy is a wonderful physician, and he does spectacular research. And when I say we, what really is he did this research, but we did it together because I helped design the study. But basically, he gave soup to individuals that in which it was lentil soup, and he could add salt to it with the soup sort of masking how much salt was in there. So he could make this bowl with like 3 grams of salt, which is like really salty. And if he gave it to people, their blood pressure goes up immediately. And he also found that if he gave a soft drink or apple juice, the blood pressure goes up within minutes. I mean, it really goes up. And then he showed that that was associated with the salt, with an increased salt in the blood, concentration in the blood. And with the sugar, it actually increases the osmolarity too. Interesting. And what he found was that if he gave water with the soup, he could block the blood pressure response and published it. We have 2 papers actually. And so we've gone on and we really feel that salt and sugar are both driving blood pressure. Salt's been well known for a long time, and it really is true. in people who are sensitive to salt. Some people are less sensitive to salt, but a lot of it is how you eat it. If you eat the salt fast so that you get thirsty, your salt concentration will go up high enough to actually activate this fructose pathway. And then if you're eating juice or drinking it, I mean, drinking apple juice, so you get a big slug, you get this big blood pressure rise. So if someone comes to see me, you're exactly right. You should say, reduce salt, reduce sugar, drink more water, and come back and let's check you again.
Yes.
And but most people don't really change what they do. You can talk to them. Most of them will, and so if you get into the situation where you can't do it with diet, yeah, I would consider an ACE inhibitor, or that would be what I would do. That one of the easiest things to do is just to increase your water intake.
Hmm.
And a lot of people don't drink enough water. And if you drink 6 glasses of water a day, you can actually help suppress the mechanisms that lead to metabolic diseases. So we did this. It's almost a whole different talk or meeting, but we found that fructose stimulates vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin. And we discovered that one of the vasopressin receptors is involved in metabolic syndrome. It's called the V1B receptor. We never talked about it in medical school because no one knew what it did. But it turns out that there's a receptor that drives cortisol production and glucagon. And these turn out to be very important in metabolic syndrome. And then, of course, it also binds other vasopressin receptors that drive up blood pressure, like
Yeah.
V1A. So it turns out that when you eat sugar or salt, you're activating this pathway, and vasopressin levels go up. And the vasopressin is actually involved in both the development of metabolic syndrome and raising blood pressure. So hydrating turns out to be protective, and we protected animals from sugar by in Western diet by just increasing their water intake. It
Yeah.
wasn't 100%, it was partial, but it was significant. So I would say, um, everyone should drink 6 to 8 glasses of water a day. And you don't want to drink 25 glasses because you can actually, um, you know, get toxic from drinking
Yeah.
too much water. You can dilute your osmolality if you outdo your ability of your kidney to get rid of water. And so, but 6 to 8 glasses of water a day is just so healthy and so good. So one of the first rules is just drink a glass of water before each meal. When you sit down to a meal, ask for a glass of water, drink it if you can before you start eating, and it
Mhm.
will help reduce any rise in salt concentrations and all that. And at the same time, it will hydrate you. It's good for you. Um, yeah, that's what you should.
Can hypertension induced by exercise, um, that, for example, if someone does high intensity or moderate intensity and he's borderline hypertension and the blood pressure starts to spike to 180 or 200 systolic or 220, and then he stops the exercise and the blood pressure goes down, does that spike cause organ damage or endothelial damage?
That one, no one knows, but I've seen a lot of people say, don't worry about a blood pressure spike during exercise. But personally, so here's what I do know. I know that when I take an animal and I raise the blood pressure to like that there's this magic transition point. So when I raise blood pressure in a animal, what happens is the blood supply to the kidney, what we call the arterioles, the afferent arterioles constrict. And this is an auto-regulation that helps keep the blood pressure in the kidney normal. So the glomerular pressure is protected from a surge in systemic blood pressure by this mechanism. But when you get around 170 in the rat, suddenly the vasoconstriction is not enough, and they start getting high pressures in the kidney that cause injury. And you can absolutely show that there's a cusp around 170, 180, where high blood pressure causes really active injury. That doesn't mean that lower blood pressures don't cause low grade injury, but I'm talking about significant injury. Um, so I have always lived thinking, and actually in people, we know that when your blood pressure is like 180, it's like a malignant type of
Yeah.
hypertension often. It's often associated with much more organ damage and progression. And in the 1950s and 1960s, when everything was kind of observational, they really could show that there was this link between this cutoff of like 180 and kidney damage. So if you're exercising and you shooting your blood pressure to 180 or higher, that bothers me as a physiologist. I know that many physicians say, well, there's no evidence that, you know, you can do bad things, but I think you probably could. And especially like if you have like if you for God's sakes, if you have like an aortic aneurysm or something like that, and you take your blood pressure to 180 to 200, I think everyone would say, don't exercise to that level. Um, a lot of people don't measure blood pressure while they're actively exercising. So
Yeah.
we don't really know how many people are in this category.
Yeah. You tend
I
to
don't
see
think
it.
it's I don't think it's as high as we think, but if
Yeah.
you are in that category, I would probably take an ACE inhibitor. We know that people who are super athletes can get cardiac hypertrophy, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think yeah, I'm more of an experimentalist than a clinical hypertension specialist. But
Mhm.
I would be cautious if you told me that that you love to exercise every day and your blood pressure shoots up to 200 during exercise, and you were my patient, I would have you on a ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker for sure.
Yeah. The thing is, we see it very often in the treadmill testing. When you do the treadmill testing and the
There
blood,
you
we
go.
measure one of the criteria is to see the blood pressure. Many people, their blood pressure spikes very high. It's not very uncommon, especially with people
Okay,
with
so maybe
borderline.
it's more. So you know from experimenting or from personal experience. So
Yes.
what do you do? How do you feel about it? I mean, the classic teaching is you let it go, but what do you do?
You put them on a 24-hour blood pressure monitoring
That
and
makes.
just let them monitor and tell them to do mild to moderate exercise.
I mean, I think you're right. I don't think that like they used to say, running is always a great sport. Well, it is a great sport. But there are a lot of marathon runners that will run to the point that they get muscle breakdown and they can get acute kidney injury and they can get all kinds of issues. And, um, you know, women who become very aesthetic from running can lose their ability to menstruate and things like that. So,
Yep.
I mean, it's a great thing, but you can probably overdo it.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything in excess is not good. I- If
Probably right.
if you had to hypothesize what is the organ that has the lion's share of hypertension, is it a centric problem? You talked about the sympathetic nervous system. Is it a kidney problem? What would you say has the lion's share of hypertension cause?
I think it begins with the kidney. And I've written a lot about this. We think that it begins with anything that causes vasoconstriction to the kidney starts the whole process. And, um, certain drugs like cyclosporin cause vasoconstriction of the kidney, can cause hypertension. So sympathetic, if you get excited and your sympathetic nervous system's activated, you'll reduce blood supply to the kidney. Anything that reduces blood supply to the kidney by 40% or so will will trigger a hypertensive response. And then what happens is over time, there's a inflammation that develops in the kidney from the ischemia, from the repetitive reduction in blood flow. And that ischemia is associated with an infiltration of inflammatory cells. And those inflammatory cells continue releasing substances that maintain the vasoconstriction to the kidney. And once that happens, what it does is it reduces the ability to excrete salt, and the sodium levels go up in the blood. That triggers the systemic responses that lead to vasoconstriction of blood vessels and everything. So the whole thing is kind of tightly woven, but it begins,
in the
I
kidney.
believe it begins in the kidney. Our work really suggests that. So we think hypertension is really a kidney issue initially. Now you can have other mechanisms of hypertension like primary
Yeah.
aldosteronism and so forth that are holding on to salt a different way hormonally as opposed to ischemia to the kidney, which holds on to salt. So
Mhm.
there's other ways you can get to the same endpoint. Um, but yeah,
And can you
yeah.
test for that low-grade inflammation in the kidney or those little bit of that damage in the kidney? Can
We
you test
can't
for it?
yet, but my friend Bernardo did a beautiful study where he showed that it was associated with elevated urinary TNF alpha, and he also, this is in people, and he also measured heat shock protein reactivity in the blood, and in people with uh, this type of hypertension.
Like,
And then he also did a study where he blocked inflammation in people. Um, and when he blocked the inflammation, blood pressure came down. So others have shown this now too. So we now know that blood pressure, we were taught for 100 years that blood pressure is really a vascular hemodynamic problem. It's constriction and dilation. It's a constrictive disease, right? And vascular resistance goes up. So we're always thinking about hormones that drive vascular, uh, you know, relaxation or constriction, angiotensin, sympathetic nervous system. But what we're now learning is that there's also an inflammatory mechanism associated with hypertension.
mhm.
And so the inflammatory system seems to drive the vasoconstriction. Maybe not initially, because there are substances that will cause vasoconstriction and drive blood pressure, but to get persistent hypertension, you need this inflammation component. And there's now hundreds of papers on this, and we were some of the early investigators that kind of noted this inflammation pathway. Probably, yeah, one of the earliest.
And you said he blocked inflammation. How did he do that?
With mycophenolate, he
Mhm.
took people with psoriasis who were going to get mycophenolate anyway, and he found that they had essential hypertension. And he had them, on stable blood pressure medicine where their blood pressure wasn't well controlled. And when they put them on MMF for psoriasis, the blood pressure fell, and so did the inflammation markers in the urine. And then when he stopped the MMF, the inflammation came back and the blood pressure came up.
Is there non-pharmacological way or uh, supplements or some medication with hypothesize that lowers the inflammation of the kidney safely and that will drop blood pressure? This is, of course, not research, but just a hypothetical question.
I'm sure there might be. A lot of people trying flavanols. We have some people trying things like curcumin, and um, you know, uh, I can't I can't specifically argue for any one right now. Not, but I bet you there's some.
And this is related to renal autoregulation. You spoke about this
Yeah.
before, that the renal will have autoregulation defect.
Yeah, yeah. So what happens also is that as you develop hypertension, um, you do get altered autoregulation, and you get matrix deposition in the arterioles, and that's associated with a lesion that you can see called arterial sclerosis. And when there's the arterial sclerosis is in the kidney, it's almost always associated with hypertension. there's even a guy, a pathologist, who's developed a way to predict or to tell you what your blood pressure is based upon looking at a biopsy of the kidney. So he did a study where he could use develop a formula for kind of predicting your level of hypertension by looking at the level of arteriosclerosis in the kidney. But I know you in the early phase you can have pretty significant hypertension with mild arteriosclerosis. So the arteriosclerosis does worsen with length of hypertension as well. So I don't think his formula is quite so good, but it is true that hypertension, persistent hypertension is really linked with arteriosclerosis in the kidney, and those microvessels are constricted and they're driven by the inflammatory response. And the data is pretty strong now.
Yes. And you
I
would
mean, like hundreds of papers.
and you wouldn't necessarily detect the renal the arterial issue with the renal angiography. It could be completely normal.
Right. Right. Probably, yeah, because it's really at the microvessel. Yeah.
But is
But people with hypertension will have reduced renal blood flow. So if you do like a nuclear scan, you can show that there's a relative reduction in renal blood flow, uh, what we call high filtration fraction. Oh wait, let's see. Yeah, because the filtration fraction is the GFR divided renal blood flow, and as renal blood flow falls, the filtration fraction goes up.
is why would some people have higher response or overactive sympathetic nervous system?
I do know that there is a kidney brain sympathetic nervous system uh, connection. And when you like eat salt or when you get that ischemic response in the kidney, there's a reflex sympathetic activation of the brain that Vito Campisi and some other researchers showed, so that there is this kidney brain CNS sympathetic connection. And then, the sympathetic response probably has many things modulating it, environmental, genetic, um, a lot of factors. But it is absolutely true that some people have a more pronounced sympathetic response. Other ones can, faint when their blood is drawn, and others will develop hypertension. And I haven't studied that, so I
Yes.
don't. I'm not a sympathetic nervous system person, but I think that the variability is well known. So
And I have just few more questions about hyperlipidemia. What is your take on markers like ApoB and LP little a? Do you have any opinion on them?
I think they're important. I
Mhm.
recommend having them tested, and there are new medications that are being tested, like to lower LPA.
Do you have any thoughts on statin in primary prevention?
Oh, I have a love-hate relationship with statins. Um, I think that statins can be associated with a lot of side effects, muscle problems, fatigue, cramping. Um, it affects mitochondria. There's so many reasons I don't want to take a statin. But on the other hand, there's clinical trials suggesting that statins really make a difference in people with not even with high cholesterol, but even with, mildly elevated, and the cholesterol levels keep coming down. And there's evidence that statins may have benefits outside of lowering cholesterol. So you've got this kind of wicked side of statins, and you have this positive side. And one of the problems is that some of the clinical trials that were like published in the New England Journal, they would talk about relative improvement, not absolute improvement. So they would say, we found a 50% reduction in heart attacks compared to the control group, or 25% or something like that. But actually it went from 99.99% heart free, 1% had heart disease, and it went to 0.75% with heart disease. So it was the benefit of statins was like just for a very few people out of 100, because most people didn't have those any problems with it. So so when you look at absolute versus relative risk, if the relative risk looks big, you really think you're making a huge difference. But the absolute risk tells you that, the benefit is 1 in 400 people or something. Anyway, so it, I know that lowering cholesterol is associated with reduced cardiovascular events, uh, and um, and if you have a high cholesterol, it makes sense to go on a statin or something else. And there are alternatives. Ezetimibe, Nexletol, or something.
Yeah.
There are these other uh, compounds that have been coming out, PSK9,
Yes.
uh,
Pempedoic
and
acid.
yeah, lipidoic acid is the one
Yes.
I was thinking. But anyway, so uh, again, it's not an area that I studied, so it's really what I read or what people tell me, and I learn about it. But I have a love-hate relationship with statins.
Could you tell us about your book, The Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and where can people find it, and where can they find your work as well?
Well, I did write a book called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and it talks about fructose and sugar, and it talks about studies in animals and as well as in humans, and how we kind of discovered that there was this switch that helps drive obesity and diabetes, maybe the primary driver, and kind of our work on the discovery of this, and then what it means, and how we would recommend uh, lifestyle changes to try to help people prevent or treat obesity and diabetes. So I'm proud of it. It's based upon a lot of science, but I tried to make it easy to read. And it's available through Amazon and through most of the books, uh, you know, book companies and so forth. And I also, you can read about my work if you go to PubMed. Um, I'm Richard J. Johnson. So if you do Johnson RJ, or if you just Google Richard Johnson MD, you'll probably find my website. And I do have a website, drrichardjohnson.com, that discusses a lot of our work and has links with many, many things. I'm on Instagram um, as Dr. Richard J. Johnson. And yeah, so I think you can find stuff about me if you look either through Google or PubMed, or through, my website. I have a LinkedIn bio, Dr. Richard Johnson.
We'll link all of those. We will link all of those. And
Yeah,
I would like to thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge, and for
yeah,
all of the work and research that you have done to help elevate our understanding about the molecule fructose and kidney health and hypertension and metabolism in general. And it has been a big honor to speak to you. So thank you very much for coming.
it's really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.